Your baby just disappeared right in front of you. Not literally, they're still there, still in your arms, still in the bouncer, still on the playmat. But 30 seconds ago, they were reaching for your face, making sounds at you, locked into the conversation the two of you were having. And now the reaching has stopped. The sounds have stopped. Their face has gone somewhere flat and far away, and their eyes are aimed at a fixed point in the middle distance that isn't you and isn't anything. Not crying, not fussing, just gone. A door, somewhere behind those eyes, has closed. Most parents do the same thing in this moment. They wave a hand, they make a noise, they tell themselves the baby is tired, or overstimulated, or just needs a minute. They give it space. The baby seems fine later, life moves on. But researchers in developmental psychology have been studying exactly this moment for decades, not the milestones, not the laughter, not the crying, but the shutdown, the withdrawal, the flat effect that descends on an engaged baby like a switch being thrown. And what they found inside that stillness is not fine. It is one of the most legible signals a baby is capable of producing, and almost no parent alive knows how to read it. The most common explanation you'll hear from relatives, from parenting forums, occasionally even from well-meaning pediatricians, is that babies shut down because they hit an overstimulation ceiling. Their sensory systems are immature. Too much input, too much noise, too much everything. They pull back, they reset, they protect themselves. It's a self-regulation mechanism. Totally healthy. Don't read into it. This sounds reasonable. It is also, in many cases, completely wrong. And the distinction matters more than most parents realize. Here's the problem with the overstimulation explanation. It treats all withdrawal as the same event. It does not distinguish between a baby who breaks eye contact to track a moving object across the room and a baby whose entire affect empties out. Face flat, body still, vocalization gone, the quality of presence simply absent. Researchers who study infant emotional regulation have a specific term for the second kind of event. They call it hypoarousal, or behavioral withdrawal, and it is categorically different from a sensory break. One is a baby reorganizing their attention, the other is a baby whose developing nervous system has shifted into a mode that looks from the outside like calm, and is not. Your baby isn't taking a break. Your baby is telling you that something in their world has stopped feeling safe enough to feel anything at all. But here's where it gets deeper. Because when researchers started measuring what is actually happening inside the brain during one of these shutdowns, what they found was something nobody expected to find in an infant this young. A team of researchers studying infant stress response and behavioral withdrawal using a methodology called salivary cortisol sampling combined with behavioral affect coding made a finding that reframes the entire picture. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone. Salivary cortisol sampling lets researchers measure its concentration directly without any needle, without disturbing the baby. And behavioral affect coding lets them rate the baby's observable emotional expression on a standardized scale at the same time. When you run both measurements simultaneously on a baby who is in full behavioral shutdown, face flat, gaze averted, body still, you get a result that seems, at first, impossible. The baby's cortisol levels are not low. They are elevated to concentrations associated with acute distress. The same hormonal signature the body produces when something it depends on suddenly disappears. The stress system is running at high output. The face is showing nothing. Think of it like a circuit breaker that is tripped. The lights in the house go dark. From the street, everything looks quiet. But inside the walls, the wires are carrying more current than the system was designed to handle. The silence is not relief. The silence is the structure protecting itself from the load. Your baby isn't calm when they go quiet like that. Your baby is under more stress in that stillness than they are when they're screaming. Now I need to tell you about what happens when this becomes a pattern. Because a single shutdown, a single cortisol spike in a developing brain is not the story. The story is what chronic exposure to that same hormonal load does to a brain that is still actively building its own architecture. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has spent years documenting what they call toxic stress, the physiological effects of sustained cortisol elevation on the developing brain, with findings published in some of the most rigorous peer-reviewed literature in the field. The structures most vulnerable are the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, the regions responsible for emotional regulation, stress response calibration, memory, and the basic capacity to feel safe in the world. These are also the structures under the most active construction during the first years of life. And they are acutely sensitive to cortisol. What chronic cortisol exposure does to these regions during that construction window is not metaphorical damage. It is structural. Research on the effects of early toxic stress on developing neural tissue shows measurable reductions in the complexity of dendritic branching, the physical connections between neurons, in regions that were supposed to be wiring themselves together during exactly this period. The first 1,000 days of life, roughly the span from birth until a child is walking confidently, speaking in sentences, and beginning to become recognizably themselves, represent the window of maximum cortisol sensitivity. The entire construction project happens under conditions that the stress system is either quietly supporting or quietly undermining, one unnoticed shutdown at a time. Your baby's shutdown isn't a coping mechanism that protects them. It is a distress signal that, if missed repeatedly, begins to reshape the brain that was supposed to learn that the world is safe. Now I need to tell you about an experiment, because everything just described, the cortisol, the architecture, the silent remodeling of a developing brain, was first made visible in a room with a mother and a baby and a researcher who spent 20 years trying to understand what he was watching. The still-face paradigm was designed in 1975 by Dr. Edward Tronick at Harvard University. The setup is almost insultingly simple. A mother and her infant interact normally, smiling, talking, responding to each other's cues. The baby is engaged, reading her face, active in the conversation. Then, on cue, the mother goes completely blank. Still face. No expression, no response. Eyes open, nothing behind them. She hasn't left, she is right there, and she is completely unreachable. What happens in the 2 minutes that follow is one of the most replicated behavioral sequences in all of developmental psychology. The baby notices immediately, they try to re-engage, bigger smiles, reaching, vocalizing, every bid for connection in their repertoire. When those fail, they escalate. And then, within about 90 seconds, less time than it takes most people to read a single page, the bids begin to stop. The baby starts to turn away. The effect flattens. The shutdown begins. This is what Tronick understood from 2 decades of running this paradigm. The baby is not a passive recipient of care. They are an active participant in an ongoing two-way conversation. And when that conversation stops being reciprocal, when the responses stop coming, the baby's nervous system begins updating its model of the world accordingly. Here is where researchers studying the longitudinal effects of the still-face paradigm, particularly work examining infants of mothers experiencing clinical depression or chronic stress, associated with researchers at institutions including the University of Reading, documented something that shifts this from an interesting laboratory finding into something with real weight. When emotional unavailability is not a 2-minute experiment but a pattern, something changes. Babies who repeatedly encounter an unresponsive caregiver do not keep escalating their bids for connection indefinitely. They learn, at the level of developing neural wiring, to stop trying. The shutdown stops being a response to a specific moment and begins to be the posture the baby brings to all interactions, not because they no longer need connection, because they have built their internal model of relationships around its absence. Your baby isn't shutting down because they don't need you. Your baby is shutting down because they needed you and learned somewhere in those first silent moments that the signal wasn't getting through. And now I need to say something important, because everything just described can sound like an indictment. It is not. It is a map. The tonal shift this section requires is one of care, not alarm. If you are a parent who is exhausted, who is overwhelmed, who has been present in body and absent in mind more times than you want to count, that is not a description of a bad parent. That is a description of every parent. The question is not whether you have ever gone blank. The question is whether you know what to look for, and what it means when you see it. Here's what to watch for. Not a single quiet afternoon, not one moment of stillness. The signal is a pattern, a baby who is consistently less engaged across days, less reaching, less vocalizing during face-to-face interaction, less animating toward your approach. Specifically, gaze aversion that is sustained rather than momentary, with the baby turning their face away when you initiate contact. Flat effect during alert waking periods when engagement would normally be expected. A reduction or disappearance of social smiling, which typically emerges somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks of age, and whose consistent absence or disappearance after that window is the developmental flag. Body posture that goes still or limp in response to social approach rather than orienting toward it. If you are noticing this pattern in an infant somewhere in the 4 to 6 month window, when reciprocal social interaction should be increasingly robust, and it persists across days rather than appearing on a hard Tuesday, that is a conversation to have with a pediatrician, not a diagnosis, not an emergency, a conversation. The reason the timeline matters is the same reason it always matters in early development. The plasticity argument runs in both directions. The brain that is most vulnerable to chronic stress is also the brain most capable of responding to a change in environment. Earlier identification, earlier support, and the outcomes are genuinely different from what they are at 18 months or 2 years. You have been reading this baby's face since the first hour you met them. The instinct that something is different, that the quiet has a quality that feels wrong, not just quiet, is not anxiety. It is data. Trust it. Because here is what all of the cortisol, the architecture, the learned withdrawal, the recovery, is actually telling us about what a baby is. A baby who shuts down is not broken. They are a human being who has already, in the first weeks and months of their life, built a working model of what relationships are. Whether they are reliable, whether reaching out gets answered, whether the world responds when you move toward it. That model was not chosen. It was constructed from the only material available, the faces that looked back and the ones that didn't. When you catch the shutdown, when you notice the door closing and you step back toward it, when you stay on their face even when staying is difficult, when you answer the bid before it disappears, you are not simply soothing a baby in a moment. You are adding data to the model. You are revising the architecture. You are writing, in the only language that matters right now, the first draft of what this child will believe for the rest of their life about whether connection is something the world is capable of offering. So, the next time your baby goes flat, when the reaching stops and the babbling stops and something behind their eyes closes, remember what is actually happening. That is not tiredness. That is a developing nervous system sending you the most honest communication it knows how to produce. The silence is the signal. The stillness is the speech. And somewhere inside it, a brain that is still building itself is waiting to find out what the world does when it asks for something. If your baby has ever done this and gone quiet in that particular way, turned away, closed off, drop a comment below. Tell me how old they were when you first noticed it. Tell me whether you reached back, because if you did something more important than you probably knew at the time. And if you want to understand why your baby cries harder the moment you pick them up after you've been away, not because they're angry, not because they're trying to punish you, but because of something happening deep inside the attachment system that most parents read completely backwards, that is the next video. And once you understand what's actually going on, you will never feel guilty about leaving again.